Debunking pro-choice arguments, the baby is going to suffer, the mother should abort. Welcome to this new series where I tackle the pro-choice arguments that I have come across in my time debating the abortion topic. At this point, I have had hundreds of conversations with individuals, and I have heard many different arguments for why mothers should have the right to kill their kids. The first argument we're going to cover is especially fallacious. But before we get into that, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel so you never miss a video from me. The first argument is the baby is going to suffer, the mother should abort. Essentially, the pro-choicer will argue that the baby is destined to experience a great deal of suffering in their lives. Usually, they cite broken families and abuse as the leading causes of future suffering. The solution for them is to kill the kid so that the future suffering of the kid is avoided. Oftentimes, a pro-choicer will call this a great act of mercy and that it is an act of love. Let's break down exactly what the pro-choicer is doing here in a deductive fashion. Premise 1, the human being in the womb is going to suffer greatly upon birth. Premise 2, it is better to deprive a human of their life than to allow them to suffer greatly. Therefore, to avoid the future suffering, the baby should be aborted in the womb. This argument might be attractive to some because it is rooted in a natural inclination we all have. That being to avoid suffering. No one wants to expose a kid to cruel punishment through the early years of their life. However, the question is it better to be killed in the womb or to live with a great deal of suffering? The answer is to live with a great deal of suffering. The suffering that you will endure does not determine your value. Your value comes from your human dignity, an intrinsic reality that all human beings have on the basis of being human. It is not our place to say a person will suffer and therefore their life is not worth living or protecting. First, we don't know fully how their life will be experienced because it will be their experience. Secondly, this argument assumes that suffering cannot be good, even though suffering seems to lead many people to higher goods, meaning some people suffer and then end up having great lives. This argument can be used to justify infanticide. Let me show you how. Keeping the first two premises the same, the conclusion can be altered while still adhering to the same reasoning. Here is a new argument. Premise 1, the human being in the womb is going to suffer greatly upon birth. Premise 2, it is better to deprive a human of their life than allow them to suffer greatly. Now here is where the alteration occurs. Therefore, to avoid the future suffering, the baby should be killed upon birth. What is different here? Well, now the baby is not being aborted, but rather being killed as soon as it is born. Why? Because of the same intent, to avoid all future suffering. Immediately, someone may argue that this does not work because the baby has been born. But then, they are arguing something else. Remember, the pro-choicer is not arguing that the nature of the baby changes from gestation to birth. At least, that is not how they started. They are arguing that suffering should be avoided by killing the kid. If the nature of the child is different outside of the womb than inside the womb, then they must prove something special happens in the birthing process that grants that child rights. But in this case, both aborting the child in the womb and killing the child upon birth is in accord with their reasoning and accomplishes their goal of avoiding child suffering. In short, this reasoning can very easily be used to support infanticide. Finally, let's take one last look at the argument to completely put this to rest. Let's start with premise 1. Premise 1 is the human being in the womb is going to suffer greatly upon birth. Yes, this can very likely be true, but everyone will suffer to greater and lesser degrees. Suffering is not something that can be avoided. It is a part of the human experience. For some, it will be more severe, but for all, it will be present. In short, the premise rings with truth, especially for certain human beings. Now on to premise 2. Premise 2 is, it is better to deprive a human of their life than to allow them to suffer greatly. This is a faulty premise. It is wrong to make the judgment that the baby's life is not worth living. Showing that this type of reasoning leads to infanticide, you might have already been convinced of this. How do we treat suffering? What are our remedies? For most, it will be argued that we ought to alleviate the suffering that is experienced. When someone gets sick and they feel deathly ill, we don't offer them the opportunity to die. We instead offer them care and medical treatment. When someone has mental illness, it's not considered good to allow them to kill themselves to avoid any future suffering. Instead, our society prioritizes protecting their life because we understand it is still worth living, even if they have mental health issues. We don't kill kids who are being abused by their parents. We find a better place for them to be raised. There is a reason for all of this. It would not be good to kill someone just because they are suffering. We tend to do what we perceive as good and avoid what we perceive as evil. When someone is killed because they might have a great deal of suffering to endure at one point of their life, they have now lost the opportunity to reach many of the worthwhile ends we can think of, making that action not good. For example, a child aborted because they might have a tough upbringing would be deprived of finding love one day, starting a family, having kids of their own, running a marathon, traveling the world, finding peace in our Lord Jesus Christ, and the list goes on and on. Because suffering is seen as the qualification for a death sentence, the child in the womb is deprived of numerous goods. Therefore, it is not always better to deprive a child of their life to avoid suffering. The conclusion to abort the child in the womb does not follow. Let me end with this. As I acknowledged in the beginning, avoiding suffering is a natural inclination we possess. I don't fault people for wanting to avoid it, nor do I fault them for not wanting children to experience it. However, if avoiding suffering is your highest priority, then you will miss out on many goods. You will miss out on justice, love, and courage, among other things, because you'll be forced to avoid suffering in lieu of experiencing these goods. Is that how we should view life? That our suffering puts us in chains and blocks us from experiencing what is good about the world? St. Thomas Aquinas once said, if the highest aim of a captain were to preserve his ship, he would keep it in port forever. If your highest aim is to avoid suffering, you are going to miss out on life. And that is a tragedy. Thank you so much for checking out this very first video in this series. Make sure to smash that like button if you enjoyed and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on any future videos in this series. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Until next time, everyone, God bless.